So welcome everybody. We had a very intense day, thanks to these two gentlemen and Michael Greenstone. Now the plan was, since there was a lot of questions and there were a lot of questions and discussions, which was great, and that was exactly the purpose. We wanted to carry the conversation to a more relaxed setting, next to a fireplace, even though it's not burning right now.
Thank God it's not on. Yes.
Exactly. So the plan is to have a really relaxed conversation, and soon we will turn to you, and we will bring you in as well, and please prepare your questions. But before we go into the details, we are talking to two people who are really behind the whole idea of the Growth Academy, Middle Income Trap and Creative Destruction. So that's why I wanted to start with this a little bit personal side of the story, basically. And first, I would like to start with Indermit. Indermit. So, in your book, 2007 book, you came up with this term, middle income trap. What observation in the real life made you come up with this term, and why do you think this was an issue for us to spend time and focus on?
So I worked in Latin America for quite a bit of time. I worked in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, especially those three countries. And then I moved to East Asia. And when I moved to East Asia, what happened was that we were asked by people, especially policymakers in places like Malaysia, China, and others, that they were very concerned that their future would look like Colombia and Brazil and Argentina and so on, rather than Japan and Korea and Taiwan and so on. Because they felt they had looked at these numbers, and they had seen that these countries had grown rather quickly between 1950 and 1970 or so, and then just plateaued out. And as a result of it, there had been these crises and so on. So they were asking us whether or not we had a response that does their future look like those of Latin American countries or their neighbors in East Asia. Around that time, so I had joined the East Asia region about 10 years after the World Bank had produced this book called The East Asian Miracle. And just as the World Bank published the East Asian Miracle, the East Asia had a crisis, right? And the East Asian Miracle actually didn't really have much of the story of China at all, because if you remember, in the early 90s, China was not a story yet. But by the time I got there, China was already a story, right? Essentially, Japan had started to sort of play second fiddle to China already, and so on. So what we did, along with my boss, Homi Karas, we decided to actually take a look at the region again. And what we ended up doing was we ended up rewriting this book. We ended up writing this book called East Asian Renaissance. And there, the center was China, but there were all of these other countries and so on too. And when we did that, so we wrote this book. It was basically East Asia had become a middle-income region, all of it, other than one or two countries like Cambodia. So it was about middle-income countries, about what happens to them and so on. And I remember it was called Ideas for Economic Growth, right? And when we did that, I think the last week of just as we were finishing the report, it's actually a very good report, by the way. But just as we were finishing the report, we thought, wouldn't it have been great if we called it the middle income trap? Because that's what we started to sort of use. And so my boss told me, why don't we call it that? I said, no, look, I'm going to have to rewrite the introduction again and so on, because I would have to do all the work. He would just tell me to do it. So I got lazy, and he listened to me for the first time, and which was the wrong thing to do. And then, now the only thing people remember was this middle income trap idea. But that's how the original term came up, because we had one section in there that was called Escaping the Middle Income Trap.
Indeed, it's been quite influential because even in Turkey, a lot of the politicians now are using the term middle income trap, and they are commenting on this, which is quite fascinating how big of an impact the term really had. Now I want to turn to Philippe. So I think my question will be something very similar. So you've been the one of the founding fathers of creative destruction, but I know that your thesis was not about creative destruction. Your thesis was not even about growth. So you were working on contract theory, and when I looked at your committee, they were mostly theory people. So how did you pivot, and how did you start thinking about creative destruction, which has been enormous? I mean, if you think about what where the literature is today, it's completely a revolution based. So how did you think about this in the first place?
So in fact, the way it happened is that I had read a bit, I came across Schumpeter as I tried to explain a bit, so the idea was interesting, and I felt that I had to learn some IO. So it's about entrance, incumbents, imperfect competition. And so what I did, so in my statement, my Harvard statement as a graduate student in '82, I arrived in '84, my statement of purpose. And I said I want to put imperfect competition in growth. And so I felt that I had to learn about imperfect competition first. So that's why I worked a lot in the micro part, and with Jean Tirole and Oliver Hart, although I was at Harvard, so Eric Maskin and Joe Mascolel were my advisors. But also I was working with Patrick Bolton a lot at the time, and Patrick was advised a lot by Oliver, and Jean had arrived there and wanted to see me and advise, and so I learned a lot from the IO part, and when I arrived and I did a paper called Contract as a Barrier to Entry, where we tried to argue that contracts could be used for entry deterrence purpose. The editor was Stigler, and we were rejected. Then we came out in the AER at the end, but
not bad,
which was not so bad. So already I was very much after entry incumbents, but it was very micro. And when I arrived at MIT, my neighbor was Peter Howitt, and I told Peter, look, I think you are a trained macroeconomist. You work on search theory and things, and I am been doing a lot of IO, Bellman equation I did on learning problems, learning your demand curve. So why don't we try to get together and to write a model, a growth model that would encompass the notion of creative destruction.
Peter wasn't an assistant professor.
He was visiting from a one-year visitor from Western Ontario, and I was starting as an assistant professor at MIT. So he left in late April. So we did all that between October and March, April, October 87, March, April 88.
This also reminds me of Lucas' human capital model, where people bump into each other.
That's right, exactly.
Each other more
That's right. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot from. But Peter at the time was very much into monetary economics. So growth was for him an à côté. I tried to convince him that that might be your main thing, more than the. So I was competing with Bob Clower for Peter Howitt's time at the time, and that's how we started to.
And Indermit, if you go back to your PhD days, your time here.
Yes.
How did your PhD training influence your thinking about development economics? And did you already know that you were going to work on development economics, or did things like Philippe's story, for instance, influence where you wanted to go ultimately?
So around the time that at the time that I was here, Bob Lucas was working on the mechanics of economic development. So there were two things I remember very distinctly. One was Robert Barrow was writing his book on macroeconomics, and he would try out all his mistakes on us in the class. And so we are actually responsible for part of his wealth. Yeah. And the other one was Bob Lucas was working on a thing, and that was really what led me. So I was actually a Harburger student more. So I actually came here to do public finance, but then because of Lucas, I kind of drifted in that direction. But again, I drifted again. What happened was that I came up with a human capital model, learning and so on, but it became about obsolescence. And then I really quickly figured out that I shouldn't do theory. I should leave theory to smarter people. And so I started to work on empirical things. So I was trying to sort of get measures of the obsolescence of human capital from current population surveys between 1969 and 1984. Jim is here, and these were these big data sets and so on. So I started to sort of work on those, and I remember having my first presentation in the workshop on the applications of economics that Gary Becker used to run. And I remember I spoke for about 2 minutes, and then Sherwin Rosen jumped in, Jim, and he just said, "This is all rubbish. You can't do it. I've written about it. It's impossible," etc. And Gary Becker said, "Why don't you let him finish?" I think, but he said, "No, there's no point letting him finish because this is all rubbish anyway," etc. And then this went on for an hour and a half, and I was just watching this whole thing. Everybody jumps into it, and then we come out of that, and Sherwin Rosen says, "That was a great seminar. Do you have a committee?" "I don't mind being on your committee." And I thought, my goodness, what a crazy place. I thought that I was. Anyway, so I ended up working with Gary Becker. He became my thesis chair, and Sherwin Rosen. And then Lucas stayed on, and the fourth person was Robert Willis. So I had a dream thing. And they had not won their Nobel Prizes and all yet. So they actually paid attention to people. We were scared of Jim Heckman, by the way, so I did not want to work with Jim Heckman because it was like too tough to work with Jim. Yeah.
So, today was really phenomenal. The energy was super high since the beginning till the end, and a lot of interesting ideas. And one of the things that was mentioned also, Philippe, during your talk, that, for instance, ideas getting harder to find, and, things are becoming harder. But at the same time, there was also a lot of discussion on energy transition and AI. And when we look at, for instance, developing countries like China, for instance, now it's becoming a very big producers of EVs, and indeed it looks like they are, it's leading the global market in EVs. So do you think these new big technologies or these big opportunities, the energy transition and AI, so they are really generating creative destruction, but at the same time, if you sit at the right side of the table, potentially can give you the opportunity to potentially converge closer to the frontier, maybe leapfrog in certain sectors. Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think it might. I mean, for example, AI has enormous growth potential. AI automates tasks in the production of goods and services, but it also automates tasks in the production of ideas. So now there is some attempts to assess, how much growth we gain through the channel of automating tasks in the production of goods and services. Various views there, but I think it's non-negligible. But so far there hasn't been any serious attempt at evaluating the growth potential of AI as automating tasks in the production of ideas, and I think that can be quite important. And I think a country and of course what it requires is that you need to have a good education, well-educated workforce. That's very important, and maybe introduce AI in the education system. Have a smart industrial policy. You need to have computing power. That's very important. Competition can help also. I mentioned that that's something where, not like for IT, it's important to have, open source or to have data sharing, because data access is a big input. You have two big inputs to AI, is the computing power and the data. And the data, you have to make the data widely accessible. So that's, I don't see why, China could not, or other could not, given that they've invested so much in education, that they have a pro-innovation industrial policy. I don't see why they could not leapfrog Europe, for example. That I am in Europe. The big problem we have is that now not only we are being, we move far below the US, but we are also being possibly soon leapfrogged by China, because they have a very effective industrial policy. So that's something we didn't discuss. I'm very much pro-competition, but there's been this kind of view that if you believe in competition policy, you should be against any form of industrial policy. I believe that there is a way to make industrial policy pro-competition. For example, DARPA, DARPA is a way to do industrial policy, which to some extent accommodates competition. In Europe, we don't have anything remotely close to a DARPA. So there's been a report from Bocconi trying to explain why we don't have enough breakthrough innovation in Europe. Well, partly because we underinvest in universities, all the ecosystem of innovation, universities, venture capital. We are not at all on the US standards, but also because we don't have anything remotely close to a DARPA. And so far, anything that reminiscent of industrial policy has been opposed on the ground that it would be against competition. And I think we have to move beyond that. Instead of saying I rule out any form, to have a pro-competition industrial policy to push. And so those are the things. So for example, I could very well imagine Europe being leapfrogged by China soon. That could well happen because they are very proactive.
So I want to disagree with Philippe. So, two things. I'm just trying to get their attention.
Of course.
And
No, but that's a good.
Yeah. So, so I thought you were asking about leapfrogging, as in, can you sort of go to sort of AI-based technologies all the way from essentially fairly primitive technologies. I think Philippe would agree with me. It's very difficult to leapfrog general purpose technologies. So if you didn't sort of use steam power and actually use that in production, you couldn't quickly take advantage of the advent of electricity, because electricity basically made that it essentially helped to make the shop floor more efficient, but only if you had already used steam power to reorganize the shop floor, those kind of things, right? As well as transport and so on. Now, the same thing is true if you didn't have electricity, if you don't have electricity, and many countries in the world don't have electricity, you can't be thinking about information technology then. And if you don't have it, and if you did not invest in information technology, I think it's very difficult for you to then quote unquote leapfrog to AI. Okay, so I actually do believe that you do need to go through all of these things. On the other point, I agree with Philippe in the sense that, so I think, for example, that so a big part of AI would, you have to feed it data, right? You have to feed the artificial intelligence data. And that data has to be context specific. So one of the things that I learned from people at Google and others is that what they're worried about is that the data are essentially from the US and from China. So as a result, the countries that would actually end up using AI best or harnessing the advantages of AI best and so on would actually be the US and China. So unless these other countries get their act together and digitalize their data in ways and so on. So there I agree with Philippe in the sense that I do believe that China is actually primed to actually take over
from Europe.
Right.
So, I mean, the empirical evidence now also shows...
But on industrial policy, the only thing I would say, I would agree with Philippe about this. The only thing that I feel like the informational and the infrastructural prerequisites of sound industrial policy are fairly high. So I think even when countries do meet the infrastructural prerequisites, I feel many of them don't meet the infrastructure. They don't meet the informational prerequisites. Yes. And without good information, you will fail.
You pick the wrong winner.
You will pick. You will pick losers and so. Yes.
I think so. What I'm hearing from you is that in that case, if countries don't take the right steps, this might even increase the inequality across countries because, the AI will, if they already built a certain infrastructure, it will allow certain firms to make use of the thing. Indeed, we already have evidence of that, right? So those firms that are investing more in IT are gaining more market share, more market power, and smaller firms are typany lagging behind in adopting digital tools also. That, we have a lot of studies on this.
That's a big problem we have with the...
And given that there are many more smaller firms in developing countries, I think this whole transition creates both opportunities if, the right steps are taken, but at the same time, it might also create the danger that they might be falling behind.
Exactly, and in fact, I'm not a technology pessimist, I'm more a technology optimist, but I think it's the institutions if the institutions do not adapt, and I mentioned competition, the lack of competition for IT, but AI, the upstream segments of the AI value chain are very uncompetitive. The cloud, for example, is dominated by just a few firms, and you need to have competition along the whole value chain, because otherwise you have the danger that you mentioned. That it will not deliver, but because of institutional barriers, you see, not because the technology itself is.
On the industrial policy issue, I would like to also make a quick comment. I think, because of the theories, the creative destruction theory and endogenous growth theory, we have many, many reasons why industrial policy might be needed to internalize the spillovers, etc. But when we look at the empirical evidence is a little bit shaky. We might blame the microdata, lack of microdata maybe on this. But so, for instance, when we look at the U.S. economy used to spend 2% of its GDP into R&D in 1980. Now it went up to 3.5% of GDP. And any theory, endogenous growth theory, would tell you that we should grow faster. The U.S. economy should grow faster. But in return, you've shown the numbers today. The U.S. economy is not growing faster. If anything, we are observing rising market concentration. And indeed, when we look at the microdata, there's also a strong correlation between the heaviness of the industrial policy and the rise in market concentration. So that's why I think, the empirical evidence is really, really needed to guide the discussion, right? Because when I look at the literature, I'm observing more of a religious, a kind of a bit more religious take on industrial policy rather than really focusing on.
But I want to on this. I don't want to monopolize, but you have your paper on growth and reallocation that makes very clearly the point that and that's also one distinctive feature of the Schumpeterian framework compared to other frameworks, is that if you over subsidize incumbents and if at the expense of entrants, it may be detrimental to growth, and you showed that very well in your paper. I looked at that in another paper on the effect of relaxing credit constraint on incumbents can backlash because it may make entry more costly. So that's where but also there is the idea of misallocation of R&D. You see, the question is not just how much R&D, is how you allocate R&D, how you make sure, for example, if you have an R&D tax credit system, how you make sure you target firms. It may not be only small firms. They can be firms that are large for good reasons. So you want to get the new entrants and the firm that you allow firm to grow, but you want also to get the firms to reward the firms that are big because they are good innovators. You don't want to get the firms that are big for bad reasons. So how can you use patent information, price, TFPQ, TFPR information? That's what we try to do in current work with Pete Clino and Timo Boppart and Yui Lee and Anton Abergeau to see how you can use this information to make sure that you minimize the scope for misallocation of R&D. So it's not just the amount, it's how you allocate and what are the criteria. Can you make use of this patent, TFPQ, TFPR, price information to minimize the scope for misallocation of R&D? That's a big issue.
I just want to say one quick thing on the technology part about AI and so on. If you look at the effects, the labor displacing or the labor share displacing effects of new technologies, especially AI and so on, you can argue things both ways in the sense that you can say, yes, you will get productivity increases, yes, you'll get labor displacing effects or labor share displacing effects and so on. And given the fact that AI is probably coming faster or is being mainstreamed into production and consumption and so on, probably faster than IT was, which in turn was faster than what electricity was and so on, that there'll be less time to adjust. But then, I feel like institutions like the World Bank and others should be looking as much at, not at the labor market effects, but at the public services or the essential services like healthcare and education and so on, especially in countries that are still very rural, where it has been an uphill battle, actually a losing battle to get decent healthcare and education services into rural areas. I think AI offers huge possibilities. Machine learning offers huge possibilities. It won't displace doctors and so on, but it'll actually augment their work. It'll increase their productivity and their reach and so on massively. And I think that makes me much more of an optimist, because I sort of feel that then can lead to huge improvements in productivity and so on, because you end up having a much better allocation of ability to task.
So on this point, today there were a lot of great discussions, and at some point, Philippe, you mentioned that for instance, competition authorities are a bit backward-looking. They should be more forward-looking.
Yeah.
And we talked a lot about dynamism and innovation. So while we are expecting firms and individuals to be dynamic, probably institutions have to be dynamic as well, right? And policymaking has to be dynamic as well, and which means that there has to be probably more dialogue between policymaking and research. And in Dermot, you've been to both worlds at the frontier. So what is your take on this? How can we increase this dialogue more moving forward?
Between
policymaking and research.
Yeah, so I think that it's workshops like this, that where you demonstrate the advantages of doing work which goes below the surface, And I think this was what really attracted me to your work, because you were looking at micro data to answer these questions that we were often sort of looking at very superficially. So, for example, we were looking at firm size and thinking that proxied certain things, which it didn't anymore. We were looking at inequality, very gross levels of inequality in consumption, and thinking that it was actually measuring things that we wished it did, which was socioeconomic mobility and things like that. So I think that is what really attracted me. Because you may look at a firm and you may think it's exporting, and then you actually look more deeply and you realize that it's not adding value. It's only doing that because it's getting huge subsidies and so on, etc. Yeah. So it's not because it's close to markets, but because it's close to government that is actually doing well. So there were all of these things that actually prompted me to think. So I feel like this kind of a workshop, where you have people who have access to policymakers, who are policymakers around the table, or who actually will become, who I think will become finance ministers of China and so on soon. I think that will be very good for them to actually understand that there's this huge value to it in the sense that you can make huge mistakes if you don't understand these things well. Mm-hmm. Lots of examples in the WDR about this. Yeah.
So I would like to turn to, there are already immediately questions, so I would like to turn to the audience to collect some questions. Please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great opportunity. Thank you very much for everything. We are just starting, so everything is running very well, above expectations.
I'm glad to hear that.
So I just wanted to follow up on the two previous interventions, policymakers, and then examples of infusion. I'm from Bolivia, Latin America, and our reality in general terms, is that we couldn't diversify our economies away from natural resources. We are still highly dependent on agricultural exports and then mining exports, without any level of sophistication. So the question is, how do we foster this idea of implementing creative destruction in our economies based on this legacy of high dependency on natural resources?
So that's the question.
Will you take a few more? Or no? Yes. Poland.
So that would be a question for both David and so essentially, as you showed us, there's a group of middle-income countries. The distance from the US stayed mostly flat throughout the sample, and it's kind of be rationalized throughout Philippe and Peter's framework that essentially they reach some sort of proximity to the low technology frontier and sort of stay there. That's their statistic. And then thinking about this graph that we showed about this like optimal industrial policies, right? So at the first stage, you support just factor of production accumulation, then you turn to infusion or imitation, and then you go to being like a technology leader in at least some areas. So my question would be about like the risks of trying to follow this kind of ideal path, like in reality. Right? So I'm going to be speaking a little bit from a Polish perspective. So bear in mind that the starting point of Polish economy already in like early 90s was already more like upper middle rather than lower middle income country, right? But essentially, in the historical record, there's a lot of those cases that countries try to do this infusion or like infantry industry protection, which didn't pan out so well in the long term just because of like a rampant rent seeking following this industrial policy. And the Korean example is a sort of like a happy accident in a sense, right? That when the
You could say that.
become so powerful, right, there came the crisis that helped reform. So
Korea had almost gotten to high income before the crisis, by the way.
Sure.
It slipped down again, yeah.
So Poland is a little bit on a different spectrum because in the 90s there was pretty much no industrial protection. I mean, there were like very specific sectors that were still protected very low. But still Poland, despite kind of this lack of conscious industrial policy support, managed to grow extremely fast. And what a lot of people think was the source of the success is we had a decent healthcare and more than decent education system, right? And some competition rules just enforced by the EU, and obviously the access to the EU market helped a lot in development first. So my question is wouldn't it be like, from the long-term perspective, a safer strategy, just focus on the basics, right? Get your healthcare in order. Get your education system first, like basic, primary, secondary, and then go upper education, like China invest extremely heavily in upper education and scientific research, right? Wouldn't it be like a safer path of development that doesn't fall to the risk of kind of the capture in the specific sectors?
So my own take on that would be that I would privilege horizontal policies, say education, the fact that you have trade, you are part of EU, so there is trade liberalization, you have automatically, and so I would health. I mean, the good infrastructure, things that are horizontal. You said that I think is a first order, and then on top, in Europe and maybe at European level, we might be considering this issue of why we are not doing enough breakthrough innovation in Europe, and Poland is part of Europe now, and you have very good researchers, and there we might consider the cherry on the cake. I mean, I see try to create European DARPAs as a cherry on the cake. I would privilege horizontal policy, so competition, education, a good flex security system. Those are, for me, the kind of basic ingredients, and those are the most important. And then you can consider, then you can move on and say, and if I had to do something that has some elements of industrial policy, I would try to do it pro-competition at European level, not at the level of a member state. You see what I mean? To minimize the scope for capture. Well, that would be my way. That would be my approach. So put priority on horizontal things, and I think that would be that would be my advice.
So I would agree with Philippe, and let me give you 3 examples. One from Poland, one from essentially countries like Bolivia, which are natural resource dependent, and one from a place like India, which is neither those 2 things. So Poland, if you look at Poland starting from 1990s or so, Poland did many things right. So, for example, it overhauled its education system, starting from secondary and on to higher. Of course, this meant actually that a lot of Polish people would leave because the demand for their skills would be somewhere else. And because Poland joined the European Union, there was no problem. And I think it was very good that there was no problem. It benefited others, and then it benefited Poland again after that. And by the way, the same thing happened in East Germany and West Germany too. There was a lot of them. The second thing Poland did was, Poland actually did a very good job of bringing inflation down, but steadily, slowly, and so on, and then keeping it down. As a result of it, Poland got a huge influx of foreign capital, right, from the Germany and so on. But it got a huge. I mean, if I remembered right, during the period I was looking at, it was something like $100 billion or something. This is private capital. This is not the structural funds and so on. Of course, it got those too. So as a result of all of that, so Poland actually is a very classic view of sort of investing in the horizontal policies, reform and opening up, basically, right?
Exactly.
So I think Poland actually fits that model very well. Poland is very lucky. Poland is very lucky that it actually. I think it had the best 2 decades in its history. That was what Marek Belka said between 1990 and 2008. The best 2 decades in its history. And I think Poland took advantage of that. By the way, so did the others to a lesser extent, Romania, Bulgaria. They all did that. Bulgaria just became a high-income country too, very recently. When it comes to natural resource dependent country, again, I would actually, for these countries, they tend to emphasize vertical policies a lot, industrial policy, et cetera, et cetera. When we did, so we actually wrote a report on, at the behest of the Polish presidency of the EU Council, we actually wrote a report on Europe. It's called Golden Growth, right? And actually, I would refer you to it, and you'll sort of see how Poland took advantage of all of those things in a very good way. What we then did was we looked at countries like Ukraine, countries like Kazakhstan and others that were natural resource rich, and Russia and so on. And what we found was when you depend on a few commodities, you tend to be a much more volatile economy. You go up and down a lot because you depend on one price or few prices. So one of the first things that is that you should not have a fiscal policy that is pro-cyclical. Because if you do that, that means the government is adding to the market risk and so on rather than subtracting from it. So the first one is a horizontal policy of just having at least a cyclical fiscal policy, if not counter-cyclical. Okay? And there are countries that have actually managed this and so on, and others that haven't. Then the second part, what you find is, okay, what do you do with this wealth that you're getting? Let's say that you have a commodity price boom and so on. Should you save it in a sovereign fund and so on and try to transfer it to future generations? Do you want to transfer the money that way, or do you want to transfer it some other way? And I think, again, here I would agree with Felipe. I would actually say it's very difficult for these countries to put them in these funds like sovereign wealth funds.
Like Norway. Norway is a good example.
Norway is a good example, but Norway actually discovered oil after it had very strong institutions.
Exactly. That's
if you have this thing, when you have weak institutions, a far better way for you to transfer this money to future generations is through education and health and things like that. Again, horizontal policies. So go big on those things. And if you look at these countries, at least in thing, you find they actually don't go big on it. Azerbaijan and others don't spend a lot of money on education and health, the last I checked, right? And then the third thing, which is that these countries tend to have very, very influential state-owned enterprises. And the government favors them. And when the government favors them, it disfavors the private sector, whether that private sector is domestic or foreign and so on. So the third one is competition. You have to figure out a way to put, at least at a minimum, subject these state-owned enterprises to harder budget constraints, things like that. Okay, so once you do these horizontal policies, I think you do a lot. The other one I'll tell you from India. So we just had a very nice discussion. I had a very nice discussion with Raghu Rajan from across here. And he's written a book on India. It's called Breaking the Mold. And I think the book, Philippe, has become a lot about vertical policies. That India shouldn't do industrial policy related to manufacturing because China has already occupied that space. It should get into services and so on. But when I talk with Raghu, he genuinely didn't want it to be that. He wanted to be about horizontal policies. And so I said, why don't you instead make it about, rather than about saying, is it manufacturing, is it services, is it agribusiness? Those are horizontal things. If you look at the Indian government, it actually does very well when it treats something like a mission. So it treated digitalization like a mission and did very well in spreading digital technologies across so that even poor people have access to it. It then went big on infrastructure because India was lagging in infrastructure. Again, a horizontal policy. It wasn't like favoring it in one place or the other. It was pretty horizontal. So my point was simply, if India now decides to go big on education, India's education system is very weak. But India decides in the same mission way to go after education, I tell you, you will get capital going into the places where it has the most, where it will create the most value added and so on. And you won't need to worry about whether or not India should do manufacturing or services or business. India probably has to do all of those things. It's a big country, But I think that India's next big push would be this horizontal policy of education in secondary schools, I think. But again, sorry.
Just a follow-up question, if I may, about the natural rich economies. You were mentioning competition policy and state-owned enterprises, but what about vested interest and weak institutions, and weak governments, if you may? Because you said that they may solve the problem maybe with tackling state-owned enterprises, but if you don't have rule of law, as we call it in the European Union, how do you manage this? We are looking very much at the private sector and the companies, but what if the state doesn't play its part?
Well, the first thing is that a lot of economists actually tell these countries to do industrial policies. When they know that these countries have very weak institutions, when they know that this will lead to a lot of corruption.
That's the thing.
Exactly. So first thing is, rather than what they should do, is like we guys should shut up whenever, right? Yeah, at least shut up, if not tell them to do more horizontal policies.
A lot of questions.
And vertical maybe regionally, quite. See, that's why, like Europe, for example, I would not push for, national, but more regional, so that you preserve competition.
Good.
President, thank you so much for making this Growth Academy possible. I learned so much. A question about the extra challenge for large middle-income country. I'm from China. So I'm working on middle-income trade, I'm working on industry policy and creative destruction. So I think for China, the extra sort of challenge is geopolitical factors, right? So China, in terms of GDP per capita, is still less than 20% of US level, but because of the size and the second largest economy. So, and when we think about the industrial policy in China, if you look at the policy making in China, so China's government always emphasizes how to coordinate, balance development and security. Because like high-end, sort of high-end chips cut off, that sort of thing really impact policy a lot. So China wants to import the high-quality computer chips, but they cannot. So China's government is kind of compelled to do import substitution. Not they choose to, but they compelled to. So now comes the question. So then when China cut off from that sort of supply, it's actually state-owned enterprises in China make huge investment in that sector. Private firms do not want to make any investment in it because it's so risky and so uncertain. So now this relates to the question about how to think about sort of industrial policies for large countries like China. Because now if we look at the US, so unfortunately in real world, the economic policies are not just influenced by economists, but also by experts on international relations. Once we think about, for example, industrial policies, we all know that in the United States, for example, a lot of industrial policies are actually implemented by the industry, by the Ministry of National Defense.
Yeah,
if we look at the whole list, right? So those technologies, both for military and civil sort of usages. Yeah. So so now, because of this, my question is for you. So for large countries like China, now in order to escape the middle-income trap, and also in order to do well in technology sort of innovation thing, how to really think about the industrial policies, given that it's not just domestic market failure. It could be just as a response to external sort of technology containment policy. What should we think about?
So I will maybe have a start on this. Yeah. What was I thought interesting with the DARPA, but is the mixture between top-down and bottom-up. It has a top-down part. Money comes from ministry. They have team leaders for 3-year period or whatever that come from industry or academia, and then they can elicit competing projects. So what I like with the DARPA is the idea that in fact it lends itself to competition, to the bottom-up part. You see, the bottom-up is eliciting the competing projects. So I don't know to which extent in China you can replicate something like this. You see, where you have, that's where competition is so important. To have the possibility that several, they did that for DARPA, and then they did that for BARDA, for the Biomedical Administration Development Authority. You had many labs producing RNA messenger vaccines, competing labs. And so is that something that in China you could have? I mean, China is big enough that you can have, competing enterprises. So that's what I don't. My fear a bit with China, that has to do with creative destruction, is that the fear might be that if you become too big, you may become, somehow it's not well seen. Is that the case? That we were talking about growth of firms, and is it the case that the fear might have been that you do Alibaba, you become very successful. And then if you become too successful, is it, I don't know, are you somehow, we can speak free, is there are you penalized, if you succeed too much? In France, we are very much like that. In France, there is a lot of jealousy in France. In France, when someone is doing too well, so, don't show off too much. Is there that danger a bit? When you become too big, too successful, you might, So that's one. But if you allow for multiplicity of firms to blossom and to grow, and then you could have something like DARPA and elicit competing projects. So let me respond to a question by a question. Do you feel that in China there is competition? That competition works? Is that because that's the key to DARPA? Is that there is some competition? And that I don't know. Maybe of course. And,
well, I'm going to give him an answer you won't like.
You give an answer to the question. That's right.
Yes.
So it's a question to both of you, actually.
So here's my response. You said, how should it think about industrial policy? I think China should think less about industrial policy than it does right now. Okay, I know that it is thinking about industrial policy to counter what is happening outside, to try to sort of counter it. But I think that there are many other things that China actually has within its own control, and they have to do much more with factor markets at home. Okay, so the first so I feel like China got a huge boost starting in the 90s to now because it liberalizes product markets, goods and services. So more than 90% of goods and services are now intermediated through markets. For political reasons, for other reasons, and so on, it did not do the same thing on the factor markets. Capital markets are dominated still, directed credit, etc., a lot by the public sector. When it comes to land markets, they're not. They don't function as land markets. Okay, there's still a lot of control. The third one is labor. Maybe a bit more. There has been more liberalization on the labor side and so on. But these other two markets are still. I feel like if those two markets got liberalized, China would actually get another wave of things. Again, horizontal policies rather than vertical policies. China would get a huge wave. Right now, the inefficiency with capital is allocated, the inefficiency with which land is allocated is probably China is an outlier. So when you look at capital output ratios, we were talking about it earlier, very high capital output ratios too. So then I say, okay, how should one actually do these things? There are many ways to do it. One is to actually look inwards and say, what is it that we can do to make things things more efficient unilaterally at home, right? So these are the things that one has to do. The other thing, I remember that looking at Hong Kong, for example, there's you can compare Hong Kong and you can compare China, and you can sort of see that one, I guess in terms of the things that Philippe was talking about, Institute of Freedom, competition, and so on, there were outliers, one really good and one really not so good. So in some sense, I thought there was a very natural experiment, just like Deng Xiaoping had looked at these three zones, and he had made it basically good infrastructure zone. I thought that there's a very nice way to sort of think of Hong Kong as a good institution zone and see whether or not one could start to sort of learn from that and import some of those institutions. Back in the early 2010s, there was some thinking about that for Shanghai and others. All of that disappeared. But I think these are not things that are irreversible. I think those are the sort of things that one has to sort of look at, because the stage that China is reaching now is a stage at which these other things will matter a lot more, economic freedoms and so on, where you can actually have a lot more innovation, because China has a shift to that now, right? And it would have to do that anyway, even if the external environment were benign. But now, just like the Korea example we gave, which is that when the Japanese saw that Samsung was competing a lot with Sanyo and with NEC and others, they made it harder for them to actually. It's sort of the same stage that China is at right now. So China can either go that way, the Korean way, or it can go the Japanese way, where you don't have reforms in the financial sector and so on, and then you have. And then at the same time, you have a demographic change, which is even more rapid than what happened in Japan, and at a much lower level of per capita income. Then things would look really bad in China very soon.
Yeah, because Japan has a middle income trap syndrome without being, even though they're high income.
Yeah.
Mohammed, you had
Yeah, sure.
But it's okay to be trapped at high income than to be.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah. I mean, France is trapped in high income. It's okay.
Well, we are on the way to sous-développement in France. We are transitioning to.
I hope not.
But you know the have you been to suburbs of Paris? I'll invite you to le 93, the 93.
Mohammed, please go ahead.
My question is about the political economy of growth. So when we're talking about developing countries, if I want to refer to Dan Pritchard's book back to 2016 with Eric Becker and Sunal Khan about the political impact of different firms on the prosperity of the countries in terms of the economic growth. They categorized firms in developing countries in four shapes. So the first one is the ones that are exporting mineral resources. They are looking for different policies and different government, different type of government, and they're lobbying for different type of governments. And then power brokers, the ones that monopolize the infrastructure in the country. And the third ones are, they call them magicians, like Hyundai, like Samsung, the ones doing innovation, and they create their own market in exporting. And the fourth ones are workhorses, the ones provide service and meeting the substantial needs of people. So Pritchard says that growth, these four countries, these four firms, they create a channel of feedback to politics, which makes the, as you said, makes the growth of these countries vulnerable to commodity prices, and makes the economy, put the economy into the hands of few people, which are conglomerates in oil and gas or agriculture, as Bolivia said. So when I think about this, and the other thing that Pritchard I like about his idea is that in developing countries, there is no rule of law between political/economic elites, but there is only rent and deed. So when we come on the ground of developing countries and the matter of the political economy, how we can fit innovation and creative destruction in a country where the political power are resisting for any sort of innovation.
By the way, that's true that's true not just in natural resource rich countries, that's true in a lot of countries. In fact, capitalists don't like competition, right? So somebody else has to make sure that there's competition.
And that's where it's important to have, you want government,
State capacity plays a crucial role in this matter as well. So which is, these firms are impacting the state capacity to solve the issues in the growth trajectory as well. So how we can use how we can feed the innovation.
So I don't want to. So for example, it's interesting to see the evolution of countries like Saudi Arabia, for example. You see that where now, I don't say it's my dream regime, but they realize that they are competing in that they have to make use of the resources they have. It won't be forever, and they have to make the best use they can to still be there later on in the remote future. So I mentioned the education before. Remember I told you France went into education because they faced military threat. I believe very much that cross-country competition is a driving force. I mean, when you feel that you are surrounded by countries that are becoming very dynamic, that can be one of the force that pushes, why is it that Saudi Arabia, why do you have MBS now suddenly saying, I need to do something to modernize the country, to let women, to empower women more than they used to be? Why is he doing that? I think because also he feels that, he's competing, there is Iran, there is other powers, and he wants to be powerful. And he knows that he understood that if he doesn't do anything, Saudi Arabia ceases to exist. You see, I mean, I think at some moment this, and why is now Europe finally, there used to be in Europe this kind of, a kind of very narrow way to look at competition. Europe is essentially a regulatory giant and a budgetary dwarf. That's what Europe is. And suddenly you have the Bocconi report, then you have Draghi, the call come from Italy, Draghi, the Bocconi report, saying to say we have to do something about breakthrough innovation. Why? Because we have the competition from the US and China. And we have to do something. And I believe that this plays a big role. I think it's interesting to see how together with civil, and then of course you have the triangle with civil society or whatever, but I think the cross-country competition, the benchmarking plays a big role. For example, in France, we started realizing we have to do something about the university system because we saw we were doing so badly in the Shanghai ranking. And we don't like to be the laggards of the class, and I don't know if that plays the role that military threat used to play. If that can be a driver, I don't know. What's your maybe?
I would actually. I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking about my own country. I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia. I'm thinking about countries like Jordan, and even countries like Japan, and say, just like China, I think China does not do a good job of allocating its capital. But China has a lot of capital. It has very high savings and so on, right? Now, if you look at India, India actually doesn't do a good job of allocating its human capital. I mean, in terms, especially women, right? And India doesn't have a lot of human capital. So I'm saying, India is actually now the same. I'm sure that these countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and others, before you sort of think about things like what Atlantis is talking about, I would say think about the kind of things that, where you just say, are you using your human capital well? And I don't think we are. By the way, India is not, Jordan is not, Saudi Arabia, I mean, whatever you say about Saudi Arabia, over the last few years, they have made big steps in terms of doing that, right? So I think that, so all of these countries actually need to do a lot more on those things, including Turkey too.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So we are running out of time. So let's collect the last round of questions. Indeed, the number of questions are just increasing exponentially. I need to step in, but
Egypt. Yes.
I was listening to the discussion. Thank you so much for this really useful discussion. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, I think Saudi Arabia is not is kind of looking for a prosperous region more than as being defensive or seasoned to exist. Saudi Arabia existed way before, but now what we are looking at is we're looking at diversifying our economy. I think if we look at 2016 and we look at our position, GDP per capita, if I have the numbers right, was about $23,000 per capita. If we look at it today, it's about $35 per capita. That's about 50% growth. Yet, this is not enough. We are trying to maximize our GDP, our real GDP, to about 6.5 trillion in 2030. It's a very ambitious number, but if we look at the history from 2016 to 2023, we think that could be achievable, especially if we look at the special economic zones that we have. We have about 4 new special economic zones. We have several partnerships with several countries like China. Also, the role that is being played by the PIF, that's the Sovereign Wealth Fund by Saudi Arabia. It's becoming one of the largest sovereign wealth funds, competing with the Norwegian and etc.
All true. All those are true. Except that I also know that when you look at the labor market, it's a segmented labor market. There's a relatively quote unquote free market for people who come from abroad and work in Saudi Arabia, and there's a different labor market for Saudis themselves, right? Still true?
Exactly, that's true. But for speaking of the labor market,
And by the way, in one case, so I actually did some work not in Saudi Arabia, but in Bahrain and places like that. And one of the things that business people told me was that, so I said, why aren't you hiring Bahrainis? Why are you hiring Pakistanis and Indians? And he says, the thing is that when I hire a Bahraini, that's like a Catholic marriage. He said, I can never annul it, okay? And he said, Mr. Gill, do you understand the contradiction? We are a Muslim country. He said, So it's the same thing here, in the sense that you actually find there are these gross distortions that these countries need to think. Again, these are horizontal policies. These are not about the sovereign wealth fund investing in one particular thing or the other. These are general inefficiencies. So if on top of a very inefficient economic structure, even if you do good industrial policy, you're not going to get. Now, so in the case of Saudi Arabia, when we ran the numbers on this one, Saudi Arabia is actually a net saver now, in the sense that you actually found for a while Saudi Arabia was extracting more wealth from the ground and adding less to it. But Saudi Arabia has become more efficient. Saudi Arabia now actually adds more to the capital and the human capital and the institutional capital and so on from its natural wealth, But I think a lot of countries are still not doing that. They're still net dissavers. Yeah.
I almost lost my question.
Yeah.
But
I answered it. I think I answered your question before you asked it.
There are other questions. So one final question, and then we need to close. Please, yes.
Thank you. In the report, there is a separate chapter or section on trade, which is quite refreshing for the reason that my observation is that of late, in the bank, people don't talk about trade and growth, trade and development, for obvious reasons. So, but here in this report, you have mentioned trade restrictive policies, trade restrictive measures, which are like, in a way, strengthening this growth track. So
Yes.
what are your suggestions? How to bring trade back on the agenda and try to address this issue?
Can I just elaborate on this question?
Yeah.
So trade is one way of being open, of course, but being open could be also being open to ideas.
Yeah, that's right.
Individual mobility is another openness, basically,
Diaspora
or diaspora or FDI, coming
yeah.
and producing in the country. So if you can, while you're answering the question, if you can also, approach the openness more broadly than just export and import, basically.
The combination between education and openness is very powerful. So if you are, a well-educated population and you open up in all those dimensions to investments, to ideas, and to trade, you get a lot. And trade is important for at least three reasons. One, you increase market size, for your innovation, so you have a bigger market size. Because of course, if you are protectionist, the destination country will retaliate. The second thing is that trade brings competition, and we know that we innovate to escape competition, as I showed earlier. And three, we know that trade carries knowledge transfers. Is a source of knowledge transfers. There's been work by Cohen Helpman. I've done my recent work myself with Mark Melitz, showing that whenever you have trade, prior patents of a firm that exports to a country is becoming cited by the firms in that country. So trade is a fantastic, diffuser and producer of ideas and inducer of innovation and openness more generally. Openness and education together make you, I think, is a very powerful
So I think that Tawfiq's question goes to the point where, you have a world where the rich countries or the big economies of the world, not just the high-income countries, but also the larger countries like the Indias and so on, have turned against trade in a sense, have become very protectionist and so on. And what does a small economy like Pakistan do in such a thing? Well, we will actually come back to you with some specific answers, sir. But one of the things that we are already finding is the strategy for these countries tends to become actually even more. You be even more open, and you actually integrate even more with these larger economies rather than less. And part of the reason is, especially that you're going to say that you have a country that's actually doing a large economy that is doing industrial policy. If the deeper you integrate with that country, the more likely you are to get some of the benefits of their industrial policy. So that's a key thing. Now, it's harder for India and China and all to do it because there'll be immediate protections. But for small economies, it's actually much better to think. And now you do it not just with the US, but you do it with China, and you do it with the EU, you do it with everybody. So in the past, what we would tell small economies is to become spokes to the global hub. Now, there's no global hub. There are these splinters, right? So you have North America, you have Western Europe, you have East Asia, and so on. And now our strategy is that you become the hub to each one of these spokes, but you got to do it, So the strategy in many ways actually remains the same, deeper integration into these economies. It means reforms at home, of course, the kind of things that thing. But once you do that, I think that you can actually do well, even in this very, very hostile external environment.
So I would like you to save your questions for reception, which will take place at 7 p.m. downtown. So thank you, Indermit, thank you, Philippe, both for the great lectures and great panel. So thanks again for your interventions and questions, and see you tomorrow morning.